Shalom Chaverim. Jewish people have been accused of many peculiar attributes, and perhaps one of the most endearing of them is their love of questions. Of course, if you ask why Jewish people are in love with questions, invariably the answer is, why not? Actually, Talmud is full of questions. I myself, as a very young yeshiva boy, I remember that the goal of the class after listening to the lecture was to ask a good question. A good kasha. A good question meant that you understood, and now that you understood, you understood that you don't really understand. That's the form of a question. Questions are very powerful because they stop you in your track. They make you pause, and you have to reflect. Why? For what purpose? And that's why questions are probably one of the most effective ways of bringing us wisdom, and in general, a tremendous form of knowledge. So if you're just muddling along within your life, and you suddenly ask yourself, am I happy? And you answer, yes. And then you ask yourself, why am I happy? And you give another answer. You say, why does that make me happy? Actually, I'm not going to suggest that you keep on asking these questions in an infinite way, but you know something? By asking yourself these questions, you might actually come to a deeper meaning of what is happiness and why I am fortunate enough, and therefore I can and should consider myself happy. One of the most powerful of all questions that cuts across really all cultures and traditions, but for Jews is especially poignant, is the question, is there anything you would be willing to die for? You say, well, what kind of question is that? And it's a very important question, because if you're willing to die for something, that essentially motivates you to live for that ideal. For example, if a person were to say, I would die for my country. Well, the next step would be, if you're willing to give up your life for the country, shouldn't you be happy, appreciative, and celebrate being in this country? If a person says, I am willing to die for my family, so then obviously you stop and you say, if I would be willing to die for my family, why am I so hesitant to spend time living with my family? Would I die to make that extra $1,000? No. So why am I killing myself for the money? But I would die to see my family secure and safe, so that I work towards that. So essentially, the question of what are you willing to sacrifice for not only clarifies your ideals, but actually provides a focus into your daily activities to live up to those ideals that you would even be willing to die for. That is why I think many people do not understand when we talk about our great father Abraham, who was tested with 10 tests. And the last and supreme test was he willing to actually sacrifice his happiness, his future, his very flesh and blood for God? And his answer was yes. The point of it is not that he was willing to sacrifice his life or the life of his son for God. On the contrary, the most important part of the lesson is when Abraham understood that there is nothing more important than God, therefore he dedicated his life and the life of his son to serve God. In many ways, that test crystallized the truthfulness of Abraham's service. And from that day onwards, God said, I will never test you again. I know you are God-fearing, and hence I know you will live a life of divinity and of holiness. I mentioned this thought because next week we will be celebrating the liberation of a very great tzaddik. You say, what liberation? Well, a little bit more than 80 years ago, the 6th Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchok Schneerson, who lived at that time in the former Soviet Union, under the tyranny of Stalin and under the oppression of the Jewish socialists / communists, he was a man who was willing to risk his life for Judaism. And indeed, he was arrested and he was sentenced to death, kept a diary where he spoke about his harrowing experiences, much pain, much suffering, and only through great miracles was he actually freed from prison and eventually left the Soviet Union, landed up in Latvia, in Poland, and then started the great Chabad movement in the United States of America in 1940. The idea of the Rebbe willing to die for Judaism is very impressive. In fact, awe-inspiring. But I believe the most important part of that demonstration of self-sacrifice was to emphasize that if he was willing to die for Jewish education, that means he lived his life educating. If he was willing to suffer, to do a favor for a fellow Jew, that means he lived his life committed to helping Jews. If he was willing to literally be shot and imprisoned because he believed in God, then he spent his entire lifetime teaching and inspiring and elevating people to this wonderful concept of God, their creator. And that's why in this wonderful country that we live in, occasionally we forget to ask ourselves questions. And I leave you with this Friday's message. Ask yourself the question, what is most important to you in your life? What would you be willing to sacrifice for? As a Jew, I know the answer for some. I would be willing to sacrifice my very life to keep my Judaism alive. Well, God doesn't demand that. He wants you to celebrate your Judaism. Put on that tefillin. Celebrate that Shabbos. Come to the Torah class. Do the 10 Commandments. Show honor and respect to your parents. And then by living the answer to these questions, we will then legitimately progress to a very powerful question. God, when will you bring Mashiach? We are living your Torah. We love your Torah. We're willing to die for your Torah. That leads us to that question which only you, Almighty God, can give the answer. When will Mashiach come? Please, God, let it be now.
Misbedile